Mushroom Growing 101. So this is cultivating healthy and low impact produce. So this is my first little, usually I give presentations on mushrooms in general, or I give cultivation workshops. This is my first time doing a webinar on cultivating mushrooms. So hopefully this all goes well. And if you guys have any questions, I'm absolutely happy to answer them. Let's get going, shall we? So I was already kind of introduced a little bit, so I'll just go quickly through this because time is of the essence. So former chef, started mushroom hunting in 2011, obtained a certificate in mycology from the University of Victoria. I am now, I just updated this, as of a month ago, I am the second vice president of the North American Mycological Association, which is one of the largest mycological associations in the world, definitely the largest in North America. So now I'm on the board of that, so huzzah. But yes, I also launched Think Fungi in 2021. And basically right after I realized that Ottawa didn't really have a mushroom society. And I thought that was particularly odd because Toronto has one, Montreal has one, and all these small towns have one. How is it possible that Ottawa doesn't have one? So I've created the Ottawa Mushroom Society, which is really kind of Ottawa and the greater area because we have people from like Renfrew and from like Wakefield. So, it's definitely the greater Ottawa area, more of the National Capital Region society, if you will. So that's about that. So over the next hour, we're going to kind of dive into kind of fungi 101. A lot of people don't know much of anything that has to do with mushrooms, and that's completely understandable. So just kind of give us a heads up on what exactly are we talking about today. We're going to do a quick 101. Then we're going to move over to some of the health benefits that kind of ties into that fungi 101, and then go into the cultivation. So there's two components of cultivation, cultivating mushrooms. You got the indoor way of doing things, and you got the outdoor way of doing things. They're both very different ways. So we're going to cover both of those. And last but not least, we're going to go into the kitchen, and we're going to see what exactly we can do with mushrooms once we've cultivated all of those delightfully delicious mushrooms. So fungi 101. I'm going to start with some basics here. There are 3 million species of fungi, give or take 800,000. Now that seems quite extensive of a range there. So we're looking, between 2.2 million and 3.8 million species of fungi. Quite honestly, we just have absolutely no idea. We use a scientific model that tells us, based on the number that we know of and kind of areas we've looked, how many we can project and assume actually exist. And that number gives us in the vicinity of 3 million. So I say 3 million, you might see, news articles that say, oh, there's somewhere like 2.5 million. Someone might say there's 3.5 million. I've seen numbers go as low as 1 million, which I think is absolutely ridiculous. And I've seen others go up to 4 or 5 million, which again, I think is a little ridiculous. But, we can all kind of say that it falls within that 3 million species range. So that's actually more than the animal animal and insect kingdom, as well as the plantae kingdom put together. So if you put all those species together, there are still more fungi on Earth than all of them put together. There's a lot of fungi, but there's only 149,000 documented to science. So that's 5%. That's pretty crazy. And when we say documented by science, what we're really saying is we know that it's unique DNA structure. That's about it. Some of them don't even have names. We've discovered them. We've recorded them. They are a known species, but they have an unknown name, or they have a name like MGK374. They don't have real names, let's call it. So they don't have any common names, and they don't have Latin names. They just have a code essentially associated to them. So that's interesting. 5% documented. And that was kind of the purpose of, when I did that Great North American Fungi Quest that Anouk had mentioned. The goal is to get people out there and to find more mushrooms, because the more mushrooms we find, the more we can hopefully identify and proceed. That being said, there's only about 40,000 fruit bodies worldwide. So when we talk about fruit bodies, the mushrooms that actually come out of the ground or the tree. So of the 3 million species, only about 40,000 of them actually produce mushrooms. The others are things like yeast or mold, right? We don't see those producing mushrooms. They just do their thing. We got fungi that are inside of our guts doing, digestive properties. There's a specific phylum of fungi that exists only within the stomachs of herbivores to help them process grass. So there's 3 species within that phylum that we know of right now that does that. So fungi have a very wide range of work that they do, and very few of them actually go about producing mushrooms for reproduction. And of those 40,000, about 11,000 of them are found in North America. And those numbers are definitely going to change here and there. We're always discovering every year. We basically say, "Oh, remember that mushroom that we thought was the exact same in Europe and thought it was the exact same as the one that was in North America?" Turns out, completely different species. They look the same, they smell the same, they might even taste the same, but entirely different species, different DNA. And so then the numbers go up, right? So we're always kind of figuring out more. Like I said, with only 5% documented, a lot of the ones that we even already know about, we know very little about. We don't do extensive research on them. We just know they exist. So lots of information to still be gathered in the world of fungi. Now, the life cycle of the mushroom or the fungi is going to be of particular note if you're going to be cultivating mushrooms, simply because we kind of want to know, how does it grow, right? We know how plants grow, we know how animals tend to grow, but how does the fungi grow? So if we were to start at the end with the mushroom is going to drop spores, right? Sometimes they drop them, sometimes they just have them kind of sitting on a surface. They have a variety of them, but they drop those spores, they go off into the wind, la 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 la, and their end goal is to find an opposite. So, unlike a seed from a plant, which has a full DNA complex and can grow all by itself, the spores are much like, the human reproduction. So, it's looking for an opposite to attract, but we call them the positive and negatives because it's not binary in the fungal world. So, in fact, one species of mushroom, the split gill mushroom, which is quite a common mushroom, has 23,000 genders. So you would not ever say, well, one's male, one's female. No, that doesn't exist in the fungal world. The fungi do not believe in binary systems. And it likes to just kind of throw all of our scientific concepts out the door. So whatever you think of science, fungi just says no. We got our own way of doing things. And so that's one of them. So 23,000 genders. But it only needs to find its opposite in order to attract. And that's why it has 23,000, because this way it has much higher chances of finding someone who is of the opposite, and they can then form hyphae. So that's the next stage. So hyphae are, when we generally talk about hyphae, we talk about the mycelium network with hyphae at the end. And we always say hyphae are like the fingers. So they're the things that kind of move around and search and probe. But they're just tips. They're just tips. They're unicellular. They're very small. You wouldn't see them by your naked eye. But eventually, you'll have those hyphae that connect together, and boom, Bob's your uncle, or I'm Bob, or we have another Bob on the line. Either way, Bob's your uncle. Mycelium's created. There you go. That's really the true fungus that's now being created. So that mycelium starts creating their network. At the tips of the mycelium, you have the hyphae. They keep exploring for more food, more whatever the atmosphere might be, right? So if it runs into salt, fungi don't like salt too much. So if it runs into salt, it's probably going to retract itself and try to find a new route. If it finds a lot of nutrients, then it's going to say, great, let's go there. And you're going to get a whole bunch of mycelium development towards that nutritional basis. So it's essentially just exploring, sorry, it's essentially just exploring its world, this mycelium, and consuming the nutrients as it goes along. Eventually, it's going to want to reproduce. And so it's going to build up all this carbon together in one little spot. It's going to shoot up a little pin, which is a baby mushroom. And then that pin is going to form into a fully developed mushroom, which then drops the spores. And there we go. There's the life cycle of a mushroom, or the whole fungus, really. So usually, this is even lesser known information, so you guys are going to get in on a little secret here. Usually, mushrooms actually form at the ends of a mycelial network. So if you're out in the woods and you see that there is a mushroom there, it's not always the case, because sometimes they can just spread everywhere. But sometimes they'll just put it right at the end of the mycelial network, because they don't need to drop spores directly on top of, in the middle of their network. They're already there, right? What they want to do is put mushrooms all the way at the end of the network, so that when they drop spores and it hits the ground, it continues spreading in that direction, right? So just a little fun fact on that front. So as a good little too simple of a comparison, because really fungi are nothing like plants, but you'll often see references to this. The apple tree to the fungi. It's a very common comparison in the fungi world when we're trying to talk about this to people who just aren't really familiar with it. So on the left-hand side, you see mycelium. This was a picture that I took in the Ottawa Greenbelt not too long ago. This wasn't even covered by dirt. This was just, it was like that, which is kind of odd. Usually they're completely on the ground, right? You would have to move debris out of the way in order to find this, but this was just sitting there on the log. So that mycelium was strong and it was looking for some good nutrients. It was taking over that log. But that mycelium there, those white strands, those white fibers, are basically the apple tree. They are the organism. The mushroom, like the morel that's pictured there, is really just like an apple, right? It pops up as a reproductive organ on top of the mushroom or inside the mushroom. You have the spores, which is the equivalent of the apple having seeds. So we often refer to mushrooms as mushrooms, right? The beginning of this, the title of it was Mushroom Growing 101, but realistically, it should have been Fungi Growing 101 because the end result is you get a mushroom, but no one says, I'm going to go grow an apple, right? You say, I'm going to go out grow an apple tree, right? And then it's going to produce apples, and I'm going to be very happy with all the apples that I have in the fall, right? So it should be fungi growing 101, but people always refer to it as mushrooms, which is quite interesting because that's just a reproductive component to the overall organism. So it's much more complex than just a mushroom. Now, to understand how we kind of get to where we're going, and eventually, we're going to jump back in time 420 million years ago. So it's Devonian age. Basically, plant life hadn't really existed yet. You had some things that were photosynthesized. You had algae. You had a little small, bushes, if you will, or vines. But this is basically what you can imagine. There was already some aquatic life, but there was basically no terrestrial life known at that time. Fungi basically dominated the landscape. So those tall things that are in that picture, those are the fungi. So we have fossils going back to this. These things spanned the entire, so this is back when the continents were all basically one large continental shelf. So it just spanned everywhere. To this day, we still have fossils from this. So this is one of them. So this is Prototaxites. Prototaxites basically means the first fungi. You can see how this was in Saudi Arabia. This is a massive one, but the one you see in the top left corner is a specimen that was found in Guelph. In fact, the two best preserved specimens of Prototaxites actually comes from Labrador, and the other one comes from Guelph. So, yay, Canada. Ice Age for the win. So, basically, for the longest time, for about 200 years, we've seen this fossil for a long time. Scientists assumed it had to be a tree. I mean, nothing else is this big. They were basically 8 meters tall. So, you're looking at an 8-meter tall fossil that's lying down like that. There's absolutely no way that's a mushroom, right? In fact, in the 1850s, there was a biologist who hypothesized that it could be a fungus, and everyone just wrote him off as a quack. Like, there's no way that something that large could be a fungus. Are you out of your mind? Anyways, too bad for him. He died without knowing the truth. Fast forward to basically the 1960s, I believe it was, when they started pulling some tissue and they said, no, you're right. It's not. And there was already some skepticism because the rings weren't concentric. You can see that the center of it is over to the side. It's not right in the middle. Trees have concentric circles, and this one wasn't. And so that was particularly odd, but it was determined that it was eventually a fungus. And this was the first known fungus that we have. Not anymore. Now we know little small ones, but this is definitely by far the largest fungus that we've ever seen. Now, if you saw the previous slide, you saw that they are these towers, cylindrical kind of, right? It's very possible that there were caps at the top of these. We have no idea. There was no caps in the fossils that we found, but maybe they were all eaten by bugs and whatnot, long time ago. And the only thing that remained was, a really tough stem that the bugs didn't like to eat, right? We don't really know. We just assume that that's, we have the whole picture, but we don't know if we have the whole picture. So that's the first one. That's Prototaxites. Now, why is that important? Because Prototaxites, being one of the first fungi, made the plant life jealous. Plants decided that they wanted to come on Earth just like the big towers of mushrooms. There was one downside. At the time, the continental rock was literally a rock. There was no soil. Plants couldn't come down and put down their roots. The only plants that really existed at the time were basically the ones that had extremely shallow root systems that would just kind of die and then come back and then die and come back, like ragweed, basically. And still to this day, things like ragweed don't have any sort of connections with fungi because they come and they go so quickly that they can't be bothered with that. But they basically have very short roots at the time. Now they wanted to get big, right? They were jealous and they could get big, but there was only one way of doing that, and that was to team up with the fungi, right? And I say team up very loosely, but and obviously this happened through millions of years of evolution. But basically, the plants came on Earth, onto land, and made a deal with the fungi. And the deal basically went like this: fungi are able and have been already at this point for millions of years breaking down the rock around them in order to obtain the nutrients, the potassium, the calciums, the everything else that they possibly need, and absorbing them. They have an external stomach, so they can do that. They just sit on a rock. Still to this day, you see it, right? You go and you see a rock, you see lichen on it. Lichen is a fungi. So that lichen is sitting there and it's basically just degrading the rock very, very slowly. You're not going to go back the next year and see that it's degraded any further. But very slowly it is degrading that rock. It is consuming that rock and taking the nutrients. Well, when the plants came on land, they basically needed those nutrients. So they made a deal with the fungi. And to this day, 90% of all plants on Earth depend on a mycorrhizal network. If they do not have a mycorrhizal network, then they basically die. So 10% are basically just those shallow living ones, like the ones like ragweed that I mentioned, but the other 90% are very critical. Some plants, such as, I don't remember the one that my sister-in-law grows. It's a flower. I forget which one. I'm blanking. Anyways, which one is it? Very difficult to grow. Someone tell me. Someone have the answer? Flower? No. Usually you find them with the stems. They're holding up the stick, holding up the stem. Anyways, doesn't matter. That mushroom or that flower, whatever it is, has an absolute dependence on a very specific fungus, and if it doesn't have it, then you cannot grow it. So it's very much part of the botany of that plant. But all that to say, the mycorrhizal network, the mycelium network that you see underground, has two different formats of basically getting inside of the roots, but that was the deal, essentially. So if you were to pull open the root of any tree, 100% of the trees have these networks as a requirement. If you were to open them up and look at a cellular level, the mycorrhizal network of the fungi actually enter within the root system and into each individual cell. And that's how they drop in the nutrients. So they are very much dependent on each other. It also allows for water. So you might see, if there's big drought conditions, how is it that, all these plants are not dying necessarily when there's no water for a month? And the reason is because the mycelial network goes so far and so deep and is so efficient with things that it can actually pump water into the plants if required to do so. But none of this comes, the fungi are not doing this because they're being nice. And the trees aren't, taking this. The mycelium is very much in control of the situation. I say that in a forest, the fungi are the gardeners. They're the ones who decide who gets the fertilizer and who doesn't get the fertilizer, who gets the nutrients, who gets the water, everything. That's the fungi that decides that, not the plants. But why does the fungi decide this? And how do they decide it? Well, it's pretty simple, right? Their own sake, they want big, strong trees to be associated with them. They don't want the weak ones or the dying ones. They want the good, healthy ones that will provide them with benefit. And what benefit is that? Carbon. So for the longest time, mushrooms basically had to get their carbon by breaking down the rock, just like all the other nutrients. But they require the carbon in order to build their mycelial networks. It's very carbon intensive to build those mycelial networks. And so the faster they can get carbon, the better. Now, while they eat rocks, plants will photosynthesize to get their carbon. And that is a significantly more efficient method of getting carbon. So to this day, about a quarter or 1 in 4 leaves in your given forest is basically there in order to pump carbon to the fungi. That's the deal. The plants get the nutrients, the fungi get 25% of their carbon, right? So that's the deal. Makes everyone happy. So that's important to note because if you guys are going to be gardening, especially organic gardening, then you kind of want to know, okay, well, fungi are pretty instrumental in this entire process. That it's not something that you can just ignore or forget. We often forget these things, right? We think about the potassium, we think about the nitrogen levels. But what about the mycelium, right? So something to keep in mind. This is just a little side note on this, just how much mycelium there is. If I haven't emphasized how much, how important it is. So 1 teaspoon of soil does contain about a kilometer of hyphae. So again, it's kind of the unicellular. You wouldn't see this with your naked eye, but 1 teaspoon has a significant amount. So a 2 meter by 2 meter plot that's 10 centimeters deep would have enough hyphae to run straight through the earth from North Pole to South Pole. So lots of hyphae in there. I always say it's basically the glue that holds the world together. But it's also, it's because of fungi basically that we even have soil to begin with. So yay, fungi. Now, all of these guys that are doing all this fantastic work with all these plants are what we call mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi, two of them depicted here. One of them on the left is the porcini or Boletus edulis. Porcini, the king bolete, is a phenomenal mushroom. Anyone who has ever had, Italian cuisine and has gone the way of the mushroom, porcini is a phenomenal mushroom. It does grow in our region. You don't just need to have, an Italian chateau or anything like that. Right here in Ottawa, porcini does grow. So you can find these. They're fantastic mushrooms and always sought after by the mushroom foragers. On the right-hand side, you have the fly agaric, which is also the Amanita muscaria. So in our region, they're yellow, but they're actually the exact same species as the typical one that we see in pop culture that is red with the white dots all over. So that's like, it's your cell phone emoji, but it's also, one of the earliest Fantasia, Disney's Fantasia has a bunch of red mushrooms that are all dancing around. That's Amanita muscaria. Amanita muscaria is ubiquitous with the mushroom world. It is the depiction of mushrooms for so many, and basically exists all across the northern hemisphere. It's a very common mushroom. In our region, they're not red though; they are yellow, but they are also a mycorrhizal fungi. Now, they're not so edible. They are toxic. They have what we're called amatoxins, amanita, amatoxins. All amanitas, basically, or not all, most amanitas have an amatoxin, and they are not something you want to play around with. Some people do play around with it, and through extensive preparation, you can create a drink basically out of them that will kind of give you hallucinogenic properties, but I don't advise it. So just now, mycorrhizal fungi aren't the only fungi that exists. We basically have 3 different kinds of fungi that exist: mycorrhizal, saprotrophic, and parasitic. So kind of already talked about the mycorrhizal. Some of them create mushrooms, some of them don't, but they're the ones that create the underground networks and connect with the trees. Saprotrophic mushrooms or fungi are a lot more of what we're interested in when it comes to cultivation, because they just basically consume organic matter. You can't really cultivate the mycorrhizal mushrooms, unfortunately. You can create a good environment for them. So that's what truffle farmers do, right? Because truffles, being the world's most expensive culinary mushroom, people will go to quite the ends of earth in order to try their best to cultivate them. So you can plant the right forest that has the right mycorrhizal networks. People have tried this. For example, there's a good little story of someone in Texas who decided to bring over shiploads of inoculated trees from Italy in order to grow a truffle farm in Texas. It's well known that basically you plant them, you have to wait about 10 to 20 years for any truffles to start developing. And I think he paid, $1 million per tree or something like that. So massive investment of money to buy these trees, ship them all over, wait the longest time, only to realize that he had been had. Complete scam. There was nothing to do with the truffles with those trees. But he only realized 20 years later and like $100 million down the drain. So people will do quite a bit to get these. And you can try to encourage a mycorrhizal kind of farm. But really, saprotrophic is the way to go if you're trying to cultivate mushrooms. they're just trying, they just want to eat organic matter, really. They usually aren't too picky on what they're eating. They just want to break it down. So it could be a living tree, it could be a dead tree, it could be in the process of dying, it could be already well decayed, but they do all sorts of different things. And then, of course, we have parasitic fungi. We tend to give parasites a bad name, and usually I think that's, you know, warranted. But not all parasites are bad. We do have some mushrooms. I'm not going to go into parasites too much because it doesn't really apply to our presentation. But in the fungal world, we have a lot of parasitic fungi that basically turn mushrooms that nothing in the ecosystem wants into a mushroom that everything in the ecosystem wants. And so definitely a benefit, a net benefit at the end of the day. So we do have the parasitic, but again, we're just going to kind of focus on the sapotrophic from here on out. But if you have any questions on the parasite or the mycorrhizal, absolutely, I can answer those at the end. Couple examples of sapotrophic. I'm sure most of you are aware of the one on the left. So gray mold, if you ever left anything in your fridge for a little too long, you've probably developed the classic botrytis cinerea, which is the gray mold. It just likes to eat everything. It's basically everywhere around you. Every time you breathe, you're basically bringing in like 3 spores at least of fungi, of some sort of fungi. Luckily, we don't have to be too worried about it. Usually, our body temperature is too hot to allow any sort of incubation of fungi, and that's why we're not getting. Your inside of your mouth alone has about 40 different fungi, 8 of which would be novel to you, and 32 would be about the same across the board. So fungi, very common. Gray mold, very common. Lion's mane, not so common. Lion's mane is found across the northern hemisphere in places like Europe, where there's a large density and centuries of mushroom foraging. It's a threatened species. In Canada, we don't consider it a threatened species, but mainly that's because we don't really have any data to support one way or the other. But it is a cultivatable mushroom. You can grow this one at home, and it is absolutely delicious. So if you ever want to grow mushrooms, like after this presentation, consider lion's mane. I think that is, from a culinary perspective, one of the best you'll get. And from a health perspective, one of the best you'll get. So there's really no downside to this one. It's a little bit more difficult than, say, oyster mushrooms, but should be able to manage it. Speaking of health benefits, what are the health benefits? So mushrooms are low calorie, they're low fat, they're about medium carb, and they're high protein. So down over here on the right-hand side, you have a recommended daily ratio that is recommended by Health Canada and whatnot. So basically, you're looking in your day to get about 45% of your calories from carbs, 25% of your calories from fat, and 30% of your calories from protein. Now, of course, if you're on a unique diet, for example, keto, where you drop all the carbs, that's one thing. Health Canada does not recommend a keto diet. This is the proportions that they recommend. So there you go. So this is generally your recommended ratio day to day. If you look on the left-hand side, this is what makes up a mushroom. You got basically 50% carbs and basically 50% protein. You got a little bit of fat in there, but that's about it. So if you actually go, as soon as you saute those mushrooms in some butter or something like that, then your fat content is going to jump. And now you're basically right at the recommended ratio. So you can't really compete with anything else. If you look at carrots, let's say, carrots are basically all carbs. They're no fat. There's no protein. It's basically all carbs. And that's true for most vegetables. If you look at meat, it's basically all protein and fat, and there's no carbs, right? So basically, you look at any sort of food, nothing comes close to mushrooms in the ideal ingredient, if you will, in terms of a nutritional background like that. So it is recommended. It used to be recommended that you put, 5 fruit and vegetables, including mushrooms, inside of your diet. Mushrooms still are, according to Health Canada, a vegetable. I would strongly disagree with the fact that mushrooms are a vegetable, but Health Canada seems to think they are. So all that to say that the recommended from other institutes would be to incorporate mushrooms into your diet 3 times a week. I would honestly just say try to incorporate them every day. There is no reason why you can't. There's a lot of different recipes you can utilize. Most of the time, you can just chuck them on top of whatever you want, right? A little bit here, a little bit there, no big deal. But they give you so much. So you should really try your best to incorporate them into your day-to-day diet because there's a lot going on there. It's not just the perfect ratio, but they're high in fiber and they're high in vitamin D, which are two items that the majority of North Americans are actually deficient in. So again, it's not something that, I'd say if everyone in North America were to eat mushrooms just on a regular basis as if they were cheese or bread kind of thing, then we probably wouldn't be deficient in these two items. But unfortunately, that's not the case. We've always had this mycophobia, fear of mushrooms, or not really knowing what mushrooms are, kind of been weirded out by mushrooms. It's unfortunate, but there we go. Mushrooms are high in fiber. So about half of the fiber within a mushroom is soluble fiber and the other half is insoluble fiber. In our day-to-day diets, we're usually used to the insoluble fiber. That's the one that would typically be found in our vegetables as well as our breads and our grains. So this does help as we all probably know, fiber has its good beneficials with regards to stool bulk, having regular movements, to preventing constipation, etc. Right? Insoluble fiber, we know, good. Helps us go to the bathroom better. Fantastic. Soluble fiber, like the beta glucans that are found within mushrooms, are not as readily marketed because they're not really found in things like bread and everything else, right? Where big companies are promoting it. So beta glucans will lower cholesterol and glucose levels. So again, it's really good for you. It should definitely be incorporated. Vitamin D, on the other hand, is your boost. It boosts our mood, reduces depression, reduces anxiety, and of course, it boosts our immune system, which I'm sure all of that. I mean, it doesn't even matter how happy you are. I'm sure you wouldn't be mad about being happier, right? So vitamin D, very important. Now, there's a couple caveats on the vitamin D with mushrooms, though. Wild mushrooms are by far the best for vitamin D content. They have over twice the amount of the recommended daily intake, and you won't overdose on it, so it's fine to go twice over. But you can take that many, and this is just for 100 grams. So 100 grams is somewhere between 4 mushrooms and 10 mushrooms, depending on the size of the mushroom. In fact, it could be half of a mushroom, but some wild mushrooms are pretty large. But you're basically looking at 100 grams would have twice the recommended daily intake. Now, for cultivated mushrooms, like the bun mushrooms that you find in the grocery store, or even the ones that you would grow at home, their range is more like 7% to 70% of your RDI. And it's a big range. And the reason behind that is because it's all about how much UV exposure they received. Most mushrooms, like the bun mushrooms in the store, receive basically no sunlight whatsoever. They don't require sunlight. So they just grow in factories on planes. And basically, once they get harvested, maybe there's a little bit of light when someone opens the door. And then when they're being transported out, they see some sun. And then maybe on their way into the grocery store, they see a little bit more. And so they get some sun, but, no one's putting mushrooms out on pasture, for no reason. So basically, they need sunlight, but it doesn't really matter if those button mushrooms haven't seen sunlight when you get them, because mushrooms will still convert into vitamin D after they've been picked. So you can actually get your button mushrooms from the grocery store and you can go home before you cook them, put them on the windowsill inside of the sun and allow them to actually develop that vitamin D. So it can go up by about 400% in their vitamin D content. So you can actually go from that 7% to about the 70% just by putting them on the windowsill for just 20 minutes. 20 minutes is basically all you need in order to really boost that vitamin D content in those mushrooms. So that's a tip that you can definitely take to the bank. Now, for the sake of time, I can't go into all nutritional benefits, but I did want to throw a million more into one single slide. So lots of nutritional benefits. Minerals. Mushrooms are the best source of minerals. You will not find another source of minerals like what you find in mushrooms. Selenium, copper, thiamine, magnesium, phosphorus. But then we also have potassium. We get amino acids. We got 3 different B vitamins that are included in there. These are all just inside of these powerhouses of nutrition. Selenium, it's an antioxidant that helps prevent cancer and heart disease, and it boosts immune functions. Copper helps your body make and move red blood cells around. It boosts your immune system again. Bones and nerves are also affected positively. Riboflavin helps your red blood cells. Niacin helps your digestive system and your skin. Pantothenic acid helps the body regulate hormones and the nervous system. And potassium, turn sideways for that one. Potassium is extremely important for the heart, muscle, and nerve function. 100 grams of mushrooms will give you the equivalent of about a small banana's worth of potassium, which is one of the highest items with potassium. So again, if you don't really like bananas, just eat your day, eat a few mushrooms. But all this you'll see kind of from the last slide as well as this one, the reoccurring mention of immune system boosting, as well as nerves. So mushrooms are actually considered to be one of the best immune system boosters that there is out there. And I always say, when COVID was moving around, I rarely got sick, and I was just like, well, I eat a lot of mushrooms, like I said. Could be that I have no kids. I don't really know. But regardless, there's a lot of immune boosting compounds found within mushrooms, and they all just kind of build on each other. So each time you have, a bowl of mushrooms or what have you, you're basically just, taking a good dose of medicine, really, and helping you prevent any sort of ill effects. So something very important to note. And also the nerves. You see that we were talking about the nervous system with the pantothenic acid, as well as with the copper, as well as potassium. So mushrooms have been considered to be absolutely amazing for the immune system, but as well for neurogenesis and just how your brain functions. That also comes in with the vitamin D, just its play on your brain. And so we actually have, for example, reishi is a mushroom. It does grow here, but in Chinese culture, because it grows again across the northern hemisphere, reishi is considered to be the mushroom of immortality because of its massive immune boosting capabilities. For the longest time, berries were considered to be basically the top food item for antioxidants. If you want to prevent cancer, you want your antioxidants, eat berries, eat a lot of berries. Recently, about 5 to 10 years ago, they did a study with chaga mushroom, and just blueberries out of the water in antioxidant level. It's night and day. Space and berries were already the high mark. They were the most impressive, and chaga is now just about 10 times higher than the berries. Chaga is basically wood. If you were to find it, it would be wood. You'd be like, how would I eat that? You're not going to eat that. You would make tea out of it. We call it chaga coffee. People drink the chaga coffee. They usually just simmer for a while and then drink it. It doesn't taste that good, to be honest. But you can always add ingredients to it to make it taste better. You're still going to get those medicinal compounds from it. So some very interesting components there. And while we're kind of on this, I don't know how people necessarily feel about this, but we're going to talk about it a little bit because it's necessary, right? So psilocybin, aka your magic mushrooms, there's a lot of remarkable benefits that have been put out there in recent years. There was a lot actually put out in the 50s before all the clinical studies and all that have been stopped. But now we've had a resurgence over the last 5 years on new clinical studies, and it's proven to be, I hate to say the words, but kind of a miracle in a way. It's really a breakthrough, and so really looking forward to seeing kind of how the science kind of evolves with this. But so far, we're seeing that through numerous studies across United States, Canada, Europe. They've done a variety of different addiction analysis. So this is, I should put a little caveat at the beginning of this. All of these things that I'm talking about are through licensed therapists. Usually it requires going to a therapist, on a weekly basis and talking about the issue, and then conducting a very large magic mushroom trip. And that trip basically allows you to get over a mental hurdle. And that's basically how that process works. But alcohol, cigarette, drug addiction, we've seen, with people who have been unable to quit for, in a variety of different processes, have done this process, and it has a 90% effective rate. Right? Nothing has been more effective than that. You can find a lot of information on that on TED Talks. There's some medical clinicians who have put out some great presentations on that. OCD as well as PTSD have again been pushed a lot. Right now, we're talking about kind of the legalization of psilocybin. A lot of that is actually being pushed by the military And the reason behind that is for the PTSD. It has been shown to be remarkable for people to get over PTSD. And the military basically wants to be able to have, the negative connotations associated with this to be removed so that their military personnel who have experienced PTSD can, get better, right? So beyond that, you have anxiety and depression and Alzheimer's disease and dementia. So again, all these things that you're looking for, they're all mental components, right? They're all brain based. And as I mentioned, it requires a large dose at a certain point. Anxiety and depression, we do what's called microdosing. Microdosing is not necessarily super scientific at this point. There's a lot more science that still needs to go out. Microdosing, for those who are unfamiliar, is basically such a small dose that you would not feel it. If you feel it, you took too much. You should not feel it whatsoever. It's a very, very, very small dose. The idea is just kind of boost the same kind of components that everything else is doing here, but the science is still out on whether or not that's actually effective in any way. The therapy combined with the large dose has been shown to be quite effective, and it's basically because of something like this. So this is an image of basically how the brain would be functioning and how it's communicating across the board. So those who took a placebo, you can see, imagine these being different brain waves. So this might be your physical sensations in your hands, and this would be your heat monitoring sensations, right? So when you touch a stove, it sends a signal, says, hey, that's hot, and you lift your hand off the stove, right? But if you had something, so for example, a friend of mine, who already asked him if this was okay, a friend of mine did 2 tours in Afghanistan. He now has PTSD with fireworks. Every time he hears fireworks, he basically has to go and try to block out the sounds because to him, they're just bombs. And the first time I encountered that with him, it was a Canada Day, and I just said, they're just fireworks. And he goes, yeah, I get it. And he walked away, right? He understands. It's not processing, right? There's a gap in the brain communication. So imagine if over here, is the fireworks, and over here is bombs. It's telling them these are connected. It doesn't make any sense. When people have gone through the therapy, they've talked through it, and then they actually take this very large dose. This is basically what happens: this massive explosion. If you took a smaller dose, you wouldn't get anywhere near this. On a large dose, it'll build new neural pathways, basically bridges within the brain, and that allows for things like depression, to get over depression, to get over addiction, to get over PTSD, to get over an OCD behavior. You're building a new bridge, that neurogenesis that is taking place. But that's also why it's being very much studied right now for Alzheimer's and dementia, because if you're building that much new brain cells, there has to be a kind of a connection there. And it already has been shown through memory, where they've done, memory games, and then, they go through a trip, and then they do the memory games again, that it's better off. So there's a lot of medical benefits to that. But I will say that while you can grow it, it is illegal to do so. So keep that in mind. All right. That one's always a touchy subject, so I won't be going back to that. Cultivating mushrooms. We're back into the cultivating. How are we doing on time? Okay. So cultivating mushrooms. So in this picture, you see a variety of different ways of cultivating mushrooms. So in the bottom left, you have the classic way. This is what I was describing earlier. The button mushrooms growing in a factory kind of setting. There's no real light. I mean, obviously there's light bulbs that have been turned on in this case. There wouldn't be any light bulbs if no one's working in there. In the top left, you have this is reishi that's being grown, the mushroom of immortality that I was talking about. And this is outdoors with just a little tarp to protect it from the sunlight. You have shiitake logs. So again, this can be grown anywhere. If you have logs, you can inoculate them. It's just basically a tower of logs that have the mushrooms. And then these two are both being grown in bags. One of them is shaped like a log simply because why not? Mushrooms like to grow on logs, so why not keep up with that natural feel of having all the sawdust just built inside of a bag that is in the shape of a log. But that's not necessary. Most people use the little substrate blocks, and they just grow the mushrooms. So if you go and you find wild mushroom or cultivated mushrooms, exotic mushrooms at the farmer's market, this is probably how they're being grown. I don't know why this guy's wearing a mask, to be honest. So that was going to be a question. I don't know how he's wearing a mask. I've never seen anyone wear a mask in a mushroom farm, but you can't. Mushroom cultivation in general. So mushrooms are more animal than plant, and their needs correspond as much. So if we take a look at human versus tree versus mushroom, right? Now, of course, every mushroom is a little different. Every plant is a little different, and every animal is a little different. I've just used three simplistic measures here: human, tree, mushroom. So for air, well, humans require oxygen, obviously, and if we get too much CO2 around us, we will suffocate, right? Not great. Same with mushrooms. Mushrooms also require that oxygen, and too much CO2 around them will suffocate them. They'll die. Trees, on the other hand, actually require both oxygen and CO2 for their photosynthesis properties. So they don't mind a little bit of CO2. Water, obviously critical across the board, right? Everyone needs water. That's a given. Now we're made up of 60% water, so it kind of explains why we kind of need water. Trees make up about 50% water, so also still pretty high up. Mushrooms are 80 to 90% water. They are basically water with a little bit of carbon surrounding it. They require so much water that if you aren't in the place to be able to provide that water, then you really can't be cultivating mushrooms. That water is very critical to mushroom cultivation. And it could be in the form of actual moisture within the substrate, but it could also be just humidity. They require a high humidity usually as well. Energy, we obtain it through metabolizing food. Mushrooms obtain it through metabolizing food, but also through trade on the mycorrhizal networks. And trees obtain it from photosynthesis. So mushrooms are not getting it from photosynthesis. They do not photosynthesize. They will get it through their food. Like I said, they have an external stomach. So they release their enzymes, breaks down whatever they are planning to digest, and they ingest it. But they also obtain it. Those mycorrhizal mushrooms will also obtain energy through trade with those trees or other plants, as we were referring to earlier. And from nutrients, so the mushrooms will not obtain nutrients from the trees. They'll obtain carbon, which is not considered a nutrient. So they'll only really retrieve their nutrients from whatever they metabolize, just like us. Whatever we eat, we'll obtain nutrients from those. Trees, on the other hand, will actually predominantly get their nutrients from fungi, from the mycorrhizal network. So you can see there's definitely a connection, a necessity, really, between the mushroom and the tree. But the mushrooms can survive without the trees. And that's basically because they were first on terrestrial ground. Last but not least, the sunlight. So I put there with my little asterisk, we can survive without. Can we really? No, I don't think we could actually survive without the sun, of course. Can you sit inside of your house for a month and not be exposed to any sunlight and survive? Yes, you can. You might not be too happy about it, but you would survive. We obviously do get nutrients like vitamin D from sunlight, but ultimately mammals, one of the reasons why we've survived ice ages is because we have the ability to survive without sunlight. We can generate our own food, we can generate our own energy without the sun. And so that has been basically our evolutionary strength. For a tree, not so much. That Devonian age we were looking at earlier, as it progressed, we had massive rainforests. We eventually had the sun blocked out. And when that happened, all these rainforests all around the world just completely collapsed and died because there was no sun. They couldn't develop energy. They had to die. But it was during that time that mushrooms actually thrived because there was all this organic matter that they could consume, and there was no real competition to do so. So they just ate everything. So mushrooms do not require sunlight. In fact, sunlight basically dries them out. So you will find some mushrooms in fields, for example, but usually those fields are going to have a lot of moisture, or whatever that patch that they're growing on will have a lot of moisture, because otherwise the sun would just bake them. So that's kind of cultivation in general and kind of the needs and wants of mushrooms in general, right? So not so much sun, but a lot of water. They'll generate their own energy and whatnot, but they need to be provided with the substrate. So if you're growing mushrooms, there's basically three. There's the easy way, the medium way, and the pretty hard way. So the easy way is just grab a spray and grow kit. You can get these at farmers markets. You can get them online. Both of them are being displayed here in the photos. You have lion's mane on the right-hand side. You got oyster mushrooms on the left-hand side. Both of these are just growing off of a block. The entire thing has been done for you. You basically are just buying a mycelium block, and then you cut holes in it, and you give it a humid environment, and the mushrooms will grow naturally because they're ready to go. Not so much cultivation, though, just kind of fruiting. Medium level, you're buying the equipment, you get what's called spawn, plugs, or liquid culture, which has basically, they're all the same thing. They are small amounts of mycelium in different formats. And so you're going to take that small amount of mycelium, you're going to get all the rest of the ingredients that you need, you're going to mix them together, and there you go. You're now cultivating the mushrooms. Then you have the much harder method, which is actually collecting spores, putting them on a petri dish, allowing the mycelium to grow on a petri dish, scraping them off with a scalpel, putting them, and this entire time you have to do it basically within a lab because any sort of mold spores that land on it is basically contaminate your project. So unless you have, laminar flow hoods at home and stuff like that, I would kind of avoid the hard process. And since we're talking about cultivation, we're just going to focus on that medium process. So basically, steps at a glance from a picture point of view. Imagine you have a syringe, right? So inside that syringe, you would have a very small, like I'm talking 1 gram of mycelium kind of would be inside of there. And just floating around doing its thing. That the liquid inside is just the nutrition. It's basically sugar water, just so it has something to eat. Usually those last up to 6 months and can inoculate quite a few jars. So I usually do about 6 to 10 of these jars with 1 syringe. So you can get quite a way. You only need a small amount of mycelium. But this is a spawn jar. So basically it's, you put in your substrate, your wood materials or whatever it might be. We'll talk about that in a second. And you give it a nice warm environment. And after you've put your syringe, your liquid culture in this case, once you put that inside, it's going to start consuming that food and growing and filling that jar. And once it's completely full, you have a nice block of spawn. So you could just go ahead and buy spawn if you wanted to and skip this process. Saves you about a month and saves you, some risk of contamination as well. So some people buy this. A mushroom farm, the professional mushroom farms, they only buy the mushroom spawn. Very few of them will go from the beginning step, simply because it takes too long. It's a full month to go from here to here. They got to move product around, right? That's business. So they go and they spend the extra amount of money to have someone else provide them with spawn. So some mushroom farms do this process in order to sell the spawn, and others just buy the spawn and go from there. And you can do the same. Then you'd move into an actual grow bag. So this would be a 5-pound bag of substrate. So again, we don't really call it soil because it's not soil. It's usually hardwood or other components. But you would add basically 1 pound of spawn to a 5-pound bag and let that sit for a few weeks. And it's going to turn into a nice big bag of mycelium. That's completely spread out. It's networked. It's consuming the nutrients. It's happy to go. That's when you cut it open and the mushrooms start fruiting out. And then eventually you harvest. So that's basically in picture form, the process for growing. It's not too complicated. It's mostly waiting, to be honest. This is about a month in between here. This is about 3 weeks between here. Once you cut it open, you're looking at 1 to 2 weeks, and then obviously it's ready. So all in all, you're kind of looking at a 2 to 3 month window from syringe to harvest. If you go with the spawn, then you're looking at a 1 to 2 months. And if you just buy a grow kit, then all you need to do is slice it open and you got mushrooms in 1 to 2 weeks. So that's basically those little different levels there. So all in all, when you're doing the medium style difficulty, it's a race against contamination, basically. Equipment required. You got mason jars. You get specialized lids for those. You can buy those online. They have filters to release carbon dioxide as it's growing and injection points. Those injection ports are there so that you can add your syringe mycelium into it without opening the lid and allowing any sort of contamination to come in. At the end of the day, it really is just a race against. When I'm giving my cultivation workshops, I repeat, it's a race against contamination every 10 minutes, basically, because it truly is. At the end of the day, you're giving the perfect environment for fungi to grow, and mold is a fungi. So you are basically racing. You want your oyster mushrooms to grow, but you're giving everything that's required for mold to grow. So if the mold goes in there, and the mold is really, really good at growing, they know what they have a lot of practice. They know what they're doing, right? But you want the oyster mushroom. Only one is going to win, right? So your goal in cultivating mushrooms is to prevent the contamination as much as possible. So you do a lot of those steps. So that's why we have the lids that have been modified with filters and injection ports. When you buy a syringe, you got to make sure it's from a reputable source, because even inside of that liquid culture, you could have contamination already and you wouldn't know it. So you got to get the syringe from a reputable dealer. The lids, you have the injection ports. And when you're working, you work with masks, you work with surgical gloves, right? I wrote surgical vinyl, latex doesn't matter, but non-powdered gloves definitely. And then some of the other components, you need the needle for your syringe, mushroom bags, misting bottle for the humidity. You'll also keep the humidity in with a humidity tent, um, thermometer in order to gauge the temperature, hygrometer to know what the humidity level is in there. Those are two of the most common. Usually you can get one thermometer hygrometer mixed. So that's what I get, and I always tell people put it right next to your bag, so you know exactly what the temperature is next to your mushrooms and what the humidity level is. Humidity level is the most important component in that. So that's why you have misting bottle for humidity, hygrometer for humidity, humidity tent for humidity. And method for sealing a bag. So you do need to seal the bag once you mix it all together. If you have a bag sealer, fantastic, problem solved. There are other ways around it. You can use a hair straightener, you can use an iron, you can just use clamps, zip ties, whatever. But there's a variety of different ways that you can do it, from kind of MacGyvering something to a full-on just plastic sealer that costs $50. To be fair, I have done so many of these bags, and I still don't have a bag sealer. So for some reason, I just don't go for the $50 bag sealer. You also need a pressure cooker because you're going to be sterilizing things. Now, if you don't have a pressure cooker and you don't want to buy a pressure cooker, that's fine. You can use a pot to do these things. It makes it more complicated with a higher risk of contamination, but it doesn't make it impossible. By the way, this is all for indoor cultivation. This is not, has nothing to do with outdoor cultivation. Substrate. So these are some materials that you can use for substrates. So hardwood, vermiculite, coco coir. I mean, some of these things I'm sure most of you are familiar with as gardeners. So you have your vermiculite, your coco coir, soybean hulls, brown rice flour, grains. Predominantly rye is used within the industry, but you can use others. I've experimented with a few different grains with levels of success. Rye seems to be the best and is the most common. Straw. Straw is again a little finicky, because if you sterilize or pressure cook it for too long, it actually releases an enzyme that's toxic to fungi. So I don't generally recommend you start with straw. Wood chips, manure, coffee grounds, much more. So, mushrooms have been grown on books, where they just inoculate a book to show that it'll eat the pages. I've seen people inoculate cigarette butts. They have a bag full of cigarette butts and essentially will consume the cigarette butts. Now, I do not recommend that you eat those mushrooms if you grow it on cigarette butts. That is absolutely disgusting. They're generally shown from an environmental perspective on how it can consume not only cigarette butts, but also plastic. It has a really good ability to break it down, as well as oil. We've shown that it'll break down the hydrocarbon molecules into its own nutritional basis and leave a contaminated site into basically a clean organic site, because the mushrooms did their work. But that being said, what we've also learned from Chernobyl is that basically those mushrooms that will come out of contaminated ground are insanely toxic. Basically, all the contaminants are being directed straight into that mushroom. So all the land around Chernobyl, when you have a meter around a mushroom, high levels of radiation, you put it over the mushroom, and the radiation just goes off the chart. Same with lead, same with basically any heavy metals. They're really good at extracting heavy metals, so they're being used for microremediation all over the world, basically, at this point. But a lot of those things can be really toxic. So if you ever get into like mushroom hunting, for example, it's always recommended like don't pick mushrooms next to a roadway. Make sure it's not like an old landfill or an old 100-year-old apple orchard. Often use really toxic fertilizers. So don't pick mushrooms, at those old orchards. So things like this. So you got to know the source. That's the caveat there. Whatever substrate your mushroom's growing on, whether it's indoor or outdoor, whatever it's eating, that's what you're basically going to be eating. So caution. In fact, even coffee grounds shows that mushrooms will obtain caffeine. You would need to eat about 100 kilos of mushrooms in order to feel like a cup of coffee. So it's not really that much, but Now with outdoor cultivation, maybe this is more up your guys' alley. I'm not sure how most of you are gardening, but there are two different styles. So we were talking about that substrate block. At the end of the day, it's a one-time use thing. It might have one, two, or three flushes where the mushrooms come out, depending on how you're harvesting it. But at the end of the day, you basically have a bag of plastic with a block of substrate. Most people are just like, I don't know what to do with this, and they throw it out. I always tell people, if you're going to just throw it out, make sure it goes into the compost because it's fantastic compost material just in itself. But if you have a garden, which I assume most of you do, considering who I'm talking to, I would definitely recommend the garden style with that block, even if you did indoor. But you don't have to do the indoor to have the block. Again, you could just buy spawn and do this. So a lot of mushrooms, like the oyster mushrooms and wine cap mushrooms, which are the ones pictured, they thrive on basically any organic material. So you can actually just mix them in with your mulch within your garden, and they'll basically eat that mulch and fruit. So you're going to get a bunch of mushrooms inside of your garden. Now, there's no negative impact on the garden plants that we've ever seen. And the benefits are kind of up in the air a little bit. So we know that there's mycorrhizal networks that are created with plants, but usually it's specific fungi connect with specific plants. And so if you're just like, well, I just want to grow oyster mushrooms out there, like first off, oyster mushrooms are not mycorrhizal. So they're sapotrophic. So they're going to break down and eat your mulch, but they're not going to connect with any of the plants around. So it's not really enticing for anything. Wine caps, on the other hand, can be mycorrhizal. So they can go around and they can spread roots, but there hasn't been any evidence that shows that they in any way improve your vegetables or your flowers or anything like that, but it doesn't show that there's any negative either. I would say that there has been shown to be a benefit. If you're an actual gardener, then you know that we have things like pest control mechanisms, right? So fungi are a fantastic pest control. And the reason is kind of backwards, which is that fungi are considered one of the best tasting things for insects and animals. Squirrels love them, but so do slugs and insects and everything else. And so when they get into your garden and they have a choice between going for your vegetables or going for that mushroom, then they're going to go for the mushroom. Almost 9 times out of 10. So even if you don't care to eat those mushrooms, the slugs will, and then you don't have to deal with the slugs on your vegetables. So great little pest control mechanism there. The other thing that I find is that, I have a garden at my cottage. A few years ago, I'm sure all of you have the same climate as me. I don't know if it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it was an absolutely terribly wet summer. Was that just last summer? I don't even know. Anyways, so wet. My vegetable garden didn't grow basically a thing. I think I got green beans, and that was about it. Everything else just basically failed on me. But the amount of mushrooms I got was insane. I got so many mushrooms because it was so wet all the time, right? So it's kind of a diversification of your garden, right? If you're going for the vegetable component or produce, because if it's really sunny and hot, then you're going to get your tomatoes, right? But you're not going to get your mushrooms. If it's really rainy and wet and humid, then your tomatoes aren't going to grow at all, or they're just going to get fungi, pests, and blight, which is unfortunate. Downside of fungi. But you'll get all the good mushrooms like these red caps. So a little bit of diversification means that at the end of the day, at least you're not going home hungry. You do get some food out of it. So I tend to just throw them. I have mulch all around my plants. And I just mix in this with my mulch all around my plants. So I just get mushrooms randomly, like between corn stalks and everything. But if I know a lot of people do pathways, you can just sprinkle it into the pathway, and then of course, if you're moving around with some equipment, you might run over some, but no big deal. You can pick them before or just leave them to die. But so that's one style. The other one is the log style. We talked about that a little briefly there. But basically, these are oyster mushrooms. Previously, you saw shiitake mushrooms. Both of them are wood decaying mushrooms. They're sapotrophic mushrooms that like to grow on logs naturally. So in order to do something like this, they basically just get hovered off of the ground so that they don't decay into the ground. Um, you drill holes in them and you buy what are called plugs. They're basically, they look like earplugs, but they are just little plugs of mycelium. So you drill the holes in the logs, you put in your plugs, you cover it with polysporin so that no insects or anything get in there. And over the course of about a year, all that mycelium is going to go through the log and start consuming that log. And then in year two, you'll start getting mushrooms. And because your log has a sufficient amount of carbon and everything else going for it, you'll probably get mushrooms just reoccurring for the next 3 to 5 years. So it's a great initial investment for a long-term gain. And you can have massive stacks of these all over the place if you wanted to. If you have any unused logs sitting around, it's a great little experiment. I know a number of people who do it. And in fact, a lot of the shiitakes that we find in our supermarket are actually grown by kind of Ontario, Quebec, small scale, I would say medium scale farmers who will just have 100 of these piles that you see all across a little property and just growing enormous amounts of shiitake mushrooms like that. So fantastic little way of growing them. You just need to keep in mind for both the mulch way, the garden style, as well as this log style, they still require that moisture. So if it's not raining all the time, you're going to have to go out there and water those logs, which seems like a little weird to water logs, but you're growing mushrooms. You're not growing logs. So that water is definitely critical. I promised some cooking mushrooms. I know I'm over time. I know well over time already. I knew it was going to happen, but we're going to finish up strong in the kitchen. So a couple of tips. We talked about exposing it to the sunlight, so I'll just skip that one. The next tip is the microwave or grilling them to heat them up. So basically, if you want all this nutrition that's found in the mushroom, which why wouldn't you? I mean, if you're going to eat mushrooms, you might as well get the nutrition. Our bodies are incapable of actually breaking down the cell walls of a mushroom and obtaining the nutrients. So the cell walls are made of what's called chitin, which is the same material, same compounds that make up the exoskeleton of insects. It's a very, very strong compound in nature, and our body just doesn't break it down. So if you want those nutrients, then you need to break down the cell walls. And if you want to break down the cell walls, you need to expose them to heat. And our body is not warm enough to expose that heat. So raw mushrooms, fine. I ate raw mushrooms my entire upbringing, but they gave me no nutritional benefit, and I only found out now. So yeah. So microwaving them or grilling them tend to be the best way. When you saute them, you're kind of leaching some of those nutrients into the oil. So it's not necessarily the best for the nutrition, but you'll still get most of the nutrition. So you can still saute it regardless. For anyone who has gone to the kitchen and sauteed up mushrooms before, you've probably realized that it doesn't matter how much oil you put into a pan, it always seems to disappear. This is a reoccurring issue for anyone who's trying to, cook mushrooms for the first time because nothing else is like that, right? You don't need to add more fat to the meat. You don't need to add more fat in with carrots. Where does all the oil go? Well, it just keeps getting absorbed. That's what mushrooms do best. They absorb. So they're absorbing and absorbing and absorbing. And they'll absorb it up until those cell walls break. So you need to hit that heat threshold. Now, you don't want to continuously be adding fat into a pan because that's not good for you, right? And you can add quite a bit. So if you take them, you put them in a microwave first, right? Even if you're going to saute them later, put them in the microwave first, just for a minute, right? That heat is going to break their cell walls, and then you can move them into the saute pan with a small amount of oil, and it'll be like cooking carrots or anything else. It's going to be a much more simple and efficient process of sauteing your mushrooms. So that's a quick little tip there. The pickled mushrooms recipe is my go-to whenever I obviously I always have way too many mushrooms in my life. Growing them, finding them, foraging them, etc. I have a lot of mushrooms. When I don't know what to do with them and I'm just short on time, I do pickled mushrooms. So I have many jars of pickled mushrooms in my fridge at any given time, and I eat them at basically this is my day-to-day mushroom intake. So I would say it's not that difficult to eat mushrooms every day. Well, it's basically pickled mushrooms that I'm eating. So you saute up enough mushrooms that you can fit inside of a 1 liter mason jar. And then on the side, boil together a quarter cup of sugar, a cup of great olive oil. That's the caveat there. And 2 cups of the apple cider vinegar. Once that's boiled up, the sugar is dissolved, pour that directly into your mason jar with your cooked mushrooms. They're going to cook up the mushrooms a little bit longer. So when you saute the mushrooms, you only need to saute them for a minute and a half. You don't need to do a full cook. Just get them nicely, a nice sear, just to break down those cell walls. And then when you put the boiling liquid in afterwards, that will finish the cooking process. Throw in some aromatics, clove of garlic, maybe some allspice, peppercorns, herbs, whatever floats your boat. You can put nothing if you don't want, but a little bit goes a long way. Throw in a clove of garlic. Throw in something from your garden. If you grow tarragon, tarragon is amazing in this pickled mushroom recipe. So I definitely recommend tarragon and pickled mushrooms. But then, yeah, you can use this for anything. Whenever I have pizza delivered to my house, I chop up a bunch of pickled mushrooms and I throw them on the pizza. If I'm having a soup or a salad, chop them up, throw them on the salad. If you want a quick snack, crackers or bread with cream cheese and the pickled mushrooms. Boom, delicious. You can honestly use these for anything. And the reason why I say great olive oil, which I can't believe I didn't write great into that PowerPoint, but great olive oil is because that liquid is amazing just on itself, even without the mushrooms. You get a little bit of mushroom flavor, but you really get all those aromatic flavors. You get a nice vinegar, sugar, like balance, and then you get the oil. So if you just dip bread into that liquid, it's already amazing just in itself, let alone the mushrooms. So definitely recommend that recipe. That's my go-to all the time. But we also have the lion's mane chowder. Sake of time, saute those mushrooms, onion, celery, garlic. Once they're all nice and soft, deglaze it with white wine, add some milk, mushroom stock, potatoes, salt, pepper, thyme. Simmer for 20 minutes until those potatoes are nicely soft. Blend it until it's smooth. Then add a little portion of that liquid into a flour. So you're going to be thickening it up. Add that all back into the soup to thicken. And then you're basically ready. You garnish it with some cheese, some green onions. This can be made vegetarian. This can be made with bacon to make it, if you're not concerned, you can use chicken stock. Mushroom stock is kind of difficult to find sometimes. I tend to make my own. You can find it sometimes in the store, but you can also use vegetable stock or chicken stock. And if you don't mind eating meat, then definitely go start with bacon, the process, and then saute your mushrooms in the bacon, and then you can garnish it with your bacon as well. But you can make this vegan as well by using soy milk. There's all sorts of very easy to modify this according to whatever diet you have. But it's very delicious. It's basically clam chowder, but with lion's mane, which has kind of a shellfishy kind of flavor to it. So it feels really, really works well. And if you can't cook right away, I would recommend freezing. That's my number one. You want to cook the mushrooms first. Again, 80 to 90% water. If you put it in the freezer like that, all that water is going to freeze. It's going to break through the mushroom. It's not going to be good. You do not want to kind of have fresh mushrooms go into a freezer and then cook with them later. They'll be really gross. So saute them first, get out a bunch of that water, allow it to cool so that we get more of that water vapor completely out. Put it in the freezer bag. If you can vacuum seal that bag, do that because the air has moisture in it as well. However you can remove moisture, that's basically what we're trying to do. So you're going to cook it, you're going to cool it, and then hopefully you vacuum seal it, and then you can put it in the freezer. And from there, you already have cooked mushrooms. So whatever you're making, if you're doing steak and you want to put some mushrooms on top, if you're having a soup or whatever, your mushrooms are already cooked. So now you can just pull them out of the freezer and put them directly into whatever process you're basically going to be utilizing it for. Now, if push comes to shove, or if you want some dehydrated options, you can go with a dehydrator. I recommend a dehydrator, not the oven, because it's energy intensive. But 125 degrees Fahrenheit for 8 hours is enough usually to dehydrate the mushrooms. But you do need to make sure that's fully dehydrated, otherwise you're going to get mold growth. Store it in a sealed container away from the sun with some oxygen absorbers just to make sure that no moisture gets in there and makes your mushrooms moldy. But then rehydrating mushrooms isn't usually particularly great. So I would really only recommend this process if your plan is to use them for like soups or stews at a later point, just because they're not going to be, you wouldn't want to put that on anything else. Rehydrated mushrooms are not great. Um, yeah, that's basically the dehydrated component. Um, and that's basically the end. So thinkfungi.org. If any of you are interested in cultivation kits, that medium process where I was listing out all the equipment, it's basically all in our cultivation kit. If you're interested in getting one of those, uh, also at the end of this week, we should be putting out a self-paced cultivation class. So that has like videos, step by step, on how to do that. And it goes with the DIY kit. So you get the kit, you get the class, and you follow step by step at your own pace and to get your mushrooms.